President Muhammadu Buhari has written to the Senate seeking approval of 819.5 billion supplementary budget for 2022. The supplementary budget, as explained by the President in a letter read in plenary by the President of the Senate, Ahmed Lawan, is meant for the capital expenditure component of the 2022 budget, with an attendant increase of deficit to 8.17 trillion. President Buhari said he has approved a supplementary budget of 2022 appropriation of 819 billion, all of which are capital expenditure. The supplementary will be financed through additional domestic borrowings, which will raise the budget deficit for 2022 to 8.17 trillion and deficit to GDP ratio to 4.43%. With us in the studio to discuss this is Mukhtar Modibo. He is a community engagement manager at Connected Development and Follow the Money. It's a pleasure to have you join us, Modibo.
Thank you for having me.
I used to work in Bachia and my boss would say early jam. I don't know if that is correct.
Yeah.
Also joining us via Zoom is Iniobong Hussein, Head Research and Policy Advisory, Budget Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning, Iniobong. I hope you can hear me. Good morning, Iniobong.
Yeah, sorry. I have my device on mute. I said good morning to you and Mukhtar in the studio.
You know, just 24 hours ago, we saw the president transmit that supplementary budget. We'll begin the conversation with the current budget before we move into the unknown. Asking for 870-something billion. And the question on the lips of everybody was, today is 23rd. You have 7 days to the end of this year. You already have a 2023 budget that has gone through the works with little amendments underway to be passed and hopefully ready for the 1st or 2nd of January, as the case may be. Does it make sense to be asking for a complementary budget for capital expenditure in the 2022 budget rather than factor it into the current budget? Since government is a continuum, why does it have to be part of an appropriation act whose lifespan is practically expiring in a couple of days with several public holidays, in fact, within this cycle? Can you help us make sense of this new president's request on the 21st or 22nd of December 2022?
All right. First of all, I want to, divide myself into two. To be in the angle of the president and then to be in the angle of a citizen. Now, if you look at one thing as a president, what were the reasons behind the supplementary budget? The reasons were alluded to floods. I mean, we've witnessed the worst flooding disaster for like a very long time. I mean, 34 or 36 states were affected, right? And then that's the reason. And then if you go back to ask yourself, what are supplementary budgets? There are some sort of activities that were not captured or they were not appropriated and that is needed to be done, right? And the activities that were given were something that is really considerable. But the question is, what is the implementation gap, right? And then what were the implementation of the 2022 budget, right? So somewhere back, let's say two or 3 months ago, there was a ministerial retreat and stuff to just look at the scorecard of the ministers. I don't know what really happened. Is the report in public domain for people to understand what was done, how the expenditure happened and what have you. So that's from the angle. They have an activity and they deem it failed to, put those activities, and then they put it to flood, which is, all of us can understand that climate change is affecting us so hard, and then the flood has been something that affected the 36 states, which have issues of infrastructural damage and what have you. But if you come back to the public, all right, the first question that the public as a layman will be asking is, how are we getting the money? You just said it. We're getting the money from borrowings, right? Or to some extent privatization and what have you. So how long can we keep doing it? Just so you know, the 2023 budget that we don't know it's about the deficit of that budget is around half of the budget, almost 10 point something trillion. And the complete budget is around 20 point something trillion, right? So that budget has a deficit of half of it. Half of it is going to be 10 point something trillion, which is like, how do you intend to fund it? It's still by borrowings and what have you. So the question is, do we need to get this sorted out? The president is the one that knows what is there. So obviously he understands the game, but I think something needs to be done rather than just the borrowing.
I'm coming to you. You are listened to Modibo, and especially I would like to kick off with where he ended, and which is the question of borrowing. The president has tagged the 2023 a budget of consolidation. And the question in my mind would be, what are we consolidating? Is it the borrowing or the deficit? Because like he rightly pointed out, half of that would be borrowed. And that would, we're borrowing, and that would then increase the size of our foreign loans. Yeah. But what is even more worrying is the fact that these borrowings would practically disappear by way of debt service, which will go off over 6 trillion, and salaries and overhead, which will go off another 5 trillion, Max put together. Are you worried about our budget priorities as it is with the 2023 proposal?
Yeah, thanks for that question. But before I address the issue of borrowing, I would just like to take a stab also at the first question as to whether it makes sense that the president is presenting a supplementary budget just a few days to the end of the year. I think what is going to happen is that they are going to extend the capital budget implementation window to maybe May or June next year, like they did with the 2021 budget. And that would usually happen because there's actually a challenge with MDAs implementing their budgets optimally. So funds are transferred to the ministries, departments, and agencies of government for expenditure. And at the end of the fiscal year, these same MDAs that complain that the funds allocated to them to carry out their budgets are usually not sufficient, have to return such funds back to Treasury, because by law, by the 31st of December before midnight, any unspent fund has to be returned to Treasury. And in a lot of instances, it's not usually the fault of the MDAs. Sometimes very due to late cash releases and all of that. And so for last year, the budget implementation period was extended from the December 31st, when it was supposed to terminate, to May the following year. So I presume that that's the same thing that is going to happen. So we're going to have an extended period of maybe 5 months to implement the capital budgets for 2022. Now down to the question of borrowing. Definitely at this rate, it is unsustainable. If you look at the components of borrowing, which is now looking very problematic, especially if you look at it through the lens of the CBN Act. Now, under the domestic sources of borrowing for government, you have what you call the ways and means, which is the CBN overdraft. The date of the CBN Act, enacted in 2007, right, allows or permits the CBN to provide support, lending support to the federal government. However, it states that that support should not be more than 5% of the previous year's revenue. But what we've seen in recent years, especially in the last 2-3 years, is that the CBN and the federal government have continued to breach that provision of the Act, raising that borrowing to about 22 trillion naira now, which has not been captured as part of Nigeria's current debt, public debt profile. Now, if you look at the interest rates on borrowing, on that source of borrowing, which is through ways and means, it has risen from about 9.5 billion in 2017, which was just about 4 or 5 years ago, to about 1.2 trillion now. And now in that same act, it had place provisions in Section 38. Borrowings or lending should not be made to the federal government if the previous one has not been paid. But what we have seen is that the CBN has continued to breach, its own act by continuous lending to the federal government over the 5% prescribed by law, and now without the federal government to make such to the government. And the federal government is now planning to breach another section that says you cannot securitize that loan, meaning you cannot get promissory notes or it cannot be converted to bills or bonds and all of that, by also trying to securitize that loan. So it's very problematic that there's no form of restraint by the federal government in borrowing or getting money through the CBN through ways and means. As you would agree with me, the governor of Edo State had come out a couple of months ago to say that the CBN was practically printing money for the federal government to spend. Now, this has two implications. First, if you look at the World Bank Development Update for last year, it had said 20% of inflation was caused by this sort of lending to the federal government. Because if you are borrowing or printing money and borrowing to the government that's not backed up by productive activities, it sort of has implications for inflation at the end of the day. Secondly, the concentration of borrowing by the government from domestic sources crowds out private sector borrowing. So you have the federal government competing with the private sector for very, very scarce funds in capital markets to borrow to fund the budget. Now, if you now look at the utilization of even these borrowings, if you are conversant with budgets and our sort of publications, you would know that about a few days ago we had released a report on the nature of the review of the budget by the National Assembly, and you would see that from that report we had sort of postulated that the National Assembly, through its appropriation powers, was fueling inefficiency, fueling waste in how resources are allocated, to sort of programs that shouldn't be the priority of the federal government. And so if you put all this together, I would say that this borrowing is not geared towards programs that would improve the livelihoods of general populace, that would lift Nigerians out of poverty, which has been properly articulated in the National Development Plan, also put together by this government. Okay. That is not to say that they are not sort of laudable programs that the federal government has implemented. If you look at the government's rail program, you would see that has been one of the sort of projects or programs of government that is quite laudable. But
okay,
if you
so
look at the bulk of other
activities, right to you,
you would see that a lot of waste is happening, a lot of corruption is going on, and that needs to stop.
Okay, so Onyebong will come back right to you. Now let me direct this at Mukhtar. Well, from what Onyebong is saying, it seems like the CBN has given too much money to the federal government and there's no much left to give. I would like to hear your own perspective on this, his own point of view.
To be honest, if we say CBN has given money, I think that's a hearsay, because it's the governor of Edo State that come out to say CBN are printing money. And I, as a young person, I always want to verify whether or not things are happening. To be honest, a lot of irregularities are happening in the country. There are a lot of corruption. There are a lot of issues of lack of public knowledge that is not in the public domain. But the thing is, I think we cannot just come out and say, oh, okay, this is happening. In as much as it's happening, but it's not proven, right? So for me, I will not sit here and say, oh, okay, yes, CBN is printing money for the government to spend, and to the extent that we don't have any other things to print. But the thing is, a lot of check and balances is not being done you know, the newest trending videos that come out from the House of Reps, a member of House of Reps, that's Kudaje Kazaure, saying some things around the CBN governor and what have you. There have been a lot of issues around the CBN governor. To me, left to me, immediately when posters of the CBN governor started parading around the country, saying he is contesting to be president and what have you, something would have been done from then, right? But nothing has been done. That's an irregularity as well. But, you know, attesting to whether or not they are printing, I don't know. I don't have any technical know-how on that. But if they are, then we are in a mess. But if they are not, then I think we should stop parading, you know, fake news or misinformation around the public.
Okay, let me just quickly add that they actually do have, the Ways and Means is actually a legal provision. And the government has not denied that it has taken up to 20 trillion. Basically, the worry would be that the government, which would be my next question to you, Nyebong, do you think that the fact that this government seems to have it easy with accessing the Ways and Means, by the way, it is asking for another 1 trillion naira from that means in part of the letters that was written to the National Assembly. Do you think that has basically beclouded this government's ability or innovative ability, if you like, to pursue non-oil revenues? Because of all of this projected income, we are looking at earning just under 40% of this amount as projected revenue for next year, despite oil selling at above $70 or $75 per barrel. Do you think that this easy access to the Ways and Means, which has now become a problem inadvertently, has sort of prevented this government from exploring other means of revenue, by the way, which they admit is the major challenge of this country at this time?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the component of the FGN independent revenue, which is supposed to be the 80% of the operating surplus of GOEs, that's government-owned enterprises or state-owned enterprises, as the case may be, that's, you know, by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right? GOEs are supposed to remit 80% of their operating surpluses back to the Consolidated Revenue Fund account. But by the accounts or by pronouncement of even the Fiscal Responsibility Chairman, a lot of the GOEs, SOEs of the federal government have refused to remit, you know, these operating surpluses back to CRF. In 2021, it was recorded, I mean, and this was a statement made by the Fiscal Responsibility Chairman, it's in public domain, that the GOEs were owing the federal government 2.1 trillion naira as operating surplus. Now, if the federal government did not see what I would call easy money through these Ways and Means, I'm very sure that they would have mobilized the MDAs to remit operating surpluses back into the pool so that it forms part of the revenue pool of government to implement its budget. That's on one end. On the accountability leg of things, a government that is revenue challenged, that is cash trapped, would have put in place more stringent accountability mechanisms to prevent somebody like the Accountant General of the Federation from fleecing the nation's resources. It was also in the public domain, and it was reported by the EFCC that about 30 billion naira has been recovered. If we saw, you know, our sort of our revenue regime, our fiscal regime, as one which needed all of government's resources to be properly captured and collected, there would have been very little legroom for corruption of that magnitude to occur, especially as somebody who was the chief disburser of the federal government. So the federal government's practices around accountability, right, around even some instruments of states, which are the line ministries, in remitting very important revenue streams of government back into the CRF for budget support, has shown that the government has not put in as much effort in mobilizing itself internally to be able to mop up revenue, to be able to raise enough revenue to fund this budget solely because, you know, it's been very easy for you to access money through the ways and means.
Well, Mukhtar, let me direct this one at you. We're also seeing that the National Assembly is halting the 2023 budget passage over multiple errors. And it seems like they're also trading blame game to the executive, saying that they submitted 40 documents. Do you think there's a gap somewhere?
I think there has always been a gap of information, right? Information has always been a problem. So the means of transmission has been an issue as well. So I know one of the issues they said is what the House of Reps have is different from what the Senate have, and it's different from what was transmitted from the executive, which is a problem. And to be honest with you, the Ministry of Budget and Planning has transformed to some sort of way, you know, transform into that point of having, you know, before our budget cycle is something that is crazy as well. We're still developing. If you look at now, we're still operating from maybe December to January. If we have some issues like what we're trying to have now, maybe like the Senate president is saying they might reconsider it from the 1st. So it might get into maybe February before we get to the whole thing. So I think the best thing is the problem is lack of proper communication, right? So there are problems. How did the committee that is scheduled with that responsibility channel the issue? It's not the public issue, you get, but all he's trying to do is a blaming game of, oh, okay, it's not that we're the one holding the document. Just so you know, the document that got to us is not in a proper shape. And who is making it not to be in the proper shape is the executive. So we're relating back to them to harmonize this whole thing. And then after the harmonization with the executive, they now come back to the two houses to harmonize between themselves before they push it, which is a problem. I mean, I don't think that is a public issue because each and every one of them that is there knows that he is capable, he or she are capable of doing that particular job, and that's why they were sent there to represent us as well as do something that we benefit from it. So if we trust their legitimacy and their credibility for them to be there, then why wouldn't they provide service, right? They already have power, so all we need them to do is to provide the service. So I don't think that is an excuse. Basically, it's not an excuse, but they're just trying to create time to just sort of, I don't know, just put some things together. But I think the best thing is if we maintain the cycle that all of us are happy about, based on the transformation of the ministry, right, or the department, I think it will go a long way in helping us.
Eniobank, I'm coming back to you. We've talked about revenue as a major challenge of this budget, and of course we have also seen that clearly in the 2023 document. But one other area I would like you to speak to is actually cutting costs. We don't seem to have seen, as far as the document is concerned, any government effort with regards to cutting costs. You would see clearly that there had been a marginal growth in the overhead expense, now touching nearly 5 trillion naira. We have seen a proliferation of several kinds of recruitments by government agencies, ministries, and parastatals, despite a subsisting instruction that there is an embargo on recruitment. So we don't seem to be moving on the front of recommendations for the merger or even the cut down of some of these ministries, agencies, and departments of government that seem to be carrying out overlapping responsibility. Do you think that we are doing anything serious to cut down on what appears to be a waste on our budgeting system?
Thank you, and thank God you use the term waste at the end of your sort of submission, because I mean, for me, cutting waste is even more of a problem than cutting costs, because what you see in the budget, right, does not suggest. I mean, a budget like we also is supposed to be an articulation of the needs and preferences of society. It's supposed to communicate your policy plans, programs into how government revenues will be raised and spent. And your budget is supposed to be prepared in line with your medium-term expenditure framework and your national development plan. But what we've seen with the budget, as the case may be, is that resources are just allocated in a way that sort of fosters state capture, fosters corruption, and all of that. If you look at the way and manner with which, the arm of government, which is the National Assembly, appropriates funds to activities, to budget lines, to programs of government, it leaves a lot to be desired. And I would like to refer you back to that 2021-2022 review, the federal government budget review by the National Assembly that, budget had put in public domain, where we had discovered that over 5,600 projects were inserted by the National Assembly members in the 2021 budget, and over 6,400 projects in 2022, leading to, about over 900 billion in both years as National Assembly insertions. Now, if you look at the nature of these insertions, street lights, boreholes, the building of town halls, and all of that, and you ask yourself, what is the obsession with the National Assembly with installing street lights that, should be that the responsibility of maybe the states or the local governments that are closer to the people? Or what was the obsession with boreholes, with building community town halls? If you look at the myriad of challenges, that are sort of confronting the federal government, you would see that the resources are not even enough to be able to confront, these challenges. Look at tertiary education, for instance. Schools were on strike for almost 9 months. And that's because the federal government couldn't meet up with the agreement that it had signed up in 2009 with ASU. Look at our power sector. Till date, we are still hovering around 4,000 megawatts, 5,000 megawatts. Sometimes it drops down to 3,000 megawatts. And with all of these challenges, you are still allocating about a quarter of your capital budget to street lights, to boreholes, and all of that you cannot even trace. Mukhtar works in communities. You go to these communities at night, they are in perpetual darkness. So where are all these street lights that we are allocating huge state resources to, and we are getting zero value for money for at the end of the day? So this issue of waste, it needs to be properly addressed. You find the National Assembly, sometimes the executive, allocating resources to projects and placing them in ministries that neither have the capacity nor projects. And this can only lead to waste and corruption. So whilst we are looking at the cost of governance as it regards the duplication of roles and activities by several instruments of states that have been set up, but I think more attention should be focused on how these resources are even allocated to projects, to activities, and to programs of governments at the end of the day.
Thank you. Mukhtar, he said something there very, very instructive. You work in the community, you see firsthand a reflection of this budget. The transformation from what is on the paper to what it should be on the ground. From what you see, let me not preempt what your response will be. Over the years, have there seemed to be a reflection, a true appropriation of this budget in the life of the community or the society where you have visited?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say 4.
Oh, that's poor.
Very poor. Why? Then my reasons. Governance is all about demand and supply, right? The first question you ask yourself, does our budget reflect the wants and needs of the people in the communities? That's the question. To some extent, it's capital no. To some extent, it's yes. Because when last did government organize a town hall meeting, or more of like a need assessment to collect data of what are the people want? it's not all around because you're a member of House of Reps or a member of House of Assembly or a ministry sit down and think, oh, okay, something should be done here. Something should be done here, right? The people have the responsibility of telling you, okay, this is what we want, so that they can take ownership. Imagine if you wanted something here, you want a change, and you now communicate it to Trust TV management, and then they now said, oh, okay, so we're putting this thing here. Obviously, you will have a mental picture of that particular thing, and you will know how to monitor to know how it's been placed. So the first thing is there were no need assessment before our budget is being carried out. And aside that, immediately after the completion of the project, that is if the project sees the lamb line of this thing, then what is the ownership level? Are people being given ownership for them to take ownership of the project? Yes or no? To some extent, no, right? So the reality is what you see on paper. Ideally, it should be the reflection of what is on ground. But because of issues, a lot of time go around. You could see ICPC is doing constituency tracking. Just go and see the report. You cry for yourself. You know, we have seen when stores of during COVID were bust, and I don't have any justification to say, okay, I support people to go and loot government properties or something, but that is the reflection of what people are seeing. To be honest with you, we need, as government, there is that need of allowing people to take ownership of the services that the government is providing, because basically they are the beneficiaries of those particular things. So if those things are not being given to them to take ownership, you will go to a community, you will now see that the community is in need of water, and then a school is being provided. I'll give you an example with Zamfara State. Something happened somewhere ago that a small girl used to travel far distance to go and attend school. You get. What, as a sensible person, what would you do? Is to bring what do you call it, school to the community so that other people will also join because of the story of her. But we got the news that the wife of the governor bought her a motorbike.
No, that's not what she needs at that time.
What the community needs, there are numbers of people that cannot afford that work. If her parent can allow her to do that, there are numbers of communities that cannot do. I tell you, if you come back to just, let's do sector by sector. Our education sector today, the newest report by UNESCO is around 20 million.
Out of school
children, and almost certain number of them are girls, right? So go to the street in Abuja, you see a whole lot of them not in school. Now that is the education sector. That's the primary basic education. Go to the higher education. 9 months, almost 9 months, our universities have been on strike. What is the reflection of that? It's because there have been an issue of deficit in that issue. Go to our health sector, look at primary health care, for instance. Quite a number of our primary health care does not meet the minimum standard of that. A number of our primary health care in this country are not connected to the national grid, right? So the issue is, if you look at sector by sector, you will understand that a lot of time when we do budget, it's not the reflection of the people want and need.
Very quickly, in your bank, your closing statements now, but I would like you to very quickly address the budget assumptions for our revenue. The president said in his presentation that as of June, we have done just 3.something trillion in revenues, less than 50% of the projected amount for the whole year. And we see that the global headwinds are still subsisting. China is still slowed down by resurgence of COVID activity around major industrial park. The Russia-Ukrainian war doesn't seem to be abating. Interest rates are still shooting up in the US and in the European economy. And so we are not expecting the global headwinds to renege in 2023. What hopes do we have to improve our current revenue sources, if there are, and what are those new areas that we can explore? Very quickly, please.
Okay, first, I mean, on oil revenue, which is one of our major sources, need to be sustained, meaning that we have to maintain those production volumes within the 1.8 million barrels per day range. If it falls anything close to the region we had it for the bulk of this year, which was around 1.1, 1.2 million barrels, it would mean that we would be having a shortfall in our oil revenue. For non-oil, the government continues to do well, especially around as it concerns the company income tax, especially with things like custom duties and all of that. But for areas we need to look into, first, one thing that needs to be addressed, which is the elephant in the room, is subsidy, right? Subsidy, as it is going to go up almost about 6.7 to 7 trillion next year. If it remains, it would mean that, or it will take almost close to 80 to 90% of the revenue in 2023. So that needs to be addressed. Outside subsidy, on some other areas that we have failed to sort of explore or exploit in previous years, our solid mineral sector. Every single state in this country is blessed with at least one mineral resource in commercial quantity. And we've seen that Nigeria has not looked at solid minerals as a strategic revenue earner for the country. So we need to begin to exploit that sector to ensure that we're able to even key into existing trends now. If you look at the renewable energy sector as it is with transition metals like lithium, graphite, and all of that, you would see that these are areas that Nigeria needs to key into, because as it is, there's a limited global supply of lithium, of graphite.
I'm afraid, Iniobong, thank you very much for this contribution.